Hello everyone, my name is Elliot Geltz, and today I want to talk to you about a franchise that I care a great deal about, called Warhammer 40k. Now, there are a lot of videos on the internet and on YouTube and everywhere that are meant to be introductions to the franchise, where if you have no idea where to start with it, you can start right here, learn the basics of the setting and what's going on with it, and from there, explore on your own with what interests you. My goal today is to make the most succinct and straight to it introductory video possible so that if you're new to the franchise, or if you have a friend that you would like to get into the franchise because you think they like it, you can show them this, they'll learn the bare basics, and from there they can pick out something that speaks to them and go from there. So, starting from the top. Warhammer 40k is a tabletop war game where you take teams of little plastic sci-fi dudes and you play a war game where you fight your opponent's little team of plastic sci-fi dudes. To get people more invested in this war game, the company that manufactures it, GW, started commissioning writers to write stories that expanded on the little lore blurbs that came with your teams of little plastic sci-fi dudes. This has since expanded, to give the understatement of the millennium, this has since expanded into a massive, massive narrative franchise that covers, I believe, well over 70 novels, video games, online videos, I believe movies, lots and lots of different forms of media, which can be very daunting. Hence the beginning of this, which all of this begs the question of, if I'm interested in this, where do I start? So, starting from the beginning with the war game, being a war game, there are different factions. And when you go to play, you choose a faction, you get figures of little dudes from that faction, you dress them up, and then you play the game. These here are the major factions of Warhammer 40k. These are not all of them, and these can also be broken down into smaller sub-factions with their own aesthetics, rules, and their own things going on. But here is the basics of it, and it's from one of these 7, you'll most likely go, that one shines the most to me, that one I like the best. And from there, your Warhammer friend or the wiki can point out, oh, you like that one? Here's a dozen novels. Pick which one you like the cover art the most, and that's your starting point. So, to give the gist of what these are, starting with the first one and most people's favorite, the Imperium of Man. Warhammer 40k takes place 40,000 years in the future, when humanity has spread all across the Milky Way galaxy and is this massive sci-fi totalitarian regime that is horrible to live in. And that is the Imperium of Man. This is your primary human faction, and the most popular unit of the faction are the Space Marines. The Imperium of Man was led by a figure called the Emperor, this big, golden, super powerful guy who wanted humanity to be the primary rulers of the galaxy. And to that purpose, he went out conquering the galaxy. His primary forces being the Space Marines, mundane humans that were modified and augmented to be bigger, stronger, faster, and overall better at combat than a mundane human. In the Imperium of Man, there are countless different factions of Space Marines. There are mundane humans in the Imperial Guard, which are just mundane soldiers with no augments. There are the Sisters of Battle, which are like space sci-fi nun warriors that more fervently worship the Emperor than the rest of humanity, because in the wake of a whole lot of stuff, he became a deific figure that they all worship. The Imperium of Man is massive. It has so much going on. It has so many factions to dig into and choose from mundane humans to transhumanist metal robot guys in the Mechanicum to the Space Marines to all sorts of different people. Next up we have Chaos. In Warhammer, the Milky Way is the physical plane of reality, and overlapping that is a plane called the Warp, which is where sapient emotions take form and congeal into real, tangible powers and forces. It's Warhammer's version of the afterlife. When a sapient creature dies, its soul goes to the warp, and the thoughts and feelings of all sapient life take form in the warp. Chaos is all of the awful, awful, awful things that come out of the warp. Every act of violence, every act of treachery, every act of destruction, it all fuels and congeals in the warp as entities called demons. Demons which originate from one of 4 chaos gods: Khorne, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, and Nurgle, which represent violence, debauchery, cunning, and staleness of life, and just being a lazy, goopy piece of garbage. I don't think very highly of Nurgle. This faction is all about those entities being drawn into real space for the sake of conquering it, for the purposes of creating more awfulness to fuel their patrons from the warp. So the forces of Khorne are all about being horrible, mindless butcherers that go around committing acts of violence to create more violence to fuel Khorne. And it's the same for the other 3 as well. Of particular note to Chaos are the Traitor Marines, Space Marines from the Imperium of Man that betrayed the Imperium for Chaos. Why they did that is a massive, massive story that I can make multiple videos on. But that's the gist of Chaos. Next up are the Eldar. The Eldar are the Warhammer equivalent of elves. If this were a fantasy setting, and it is very much a fantasy setting on top of being a sci-fi setting, these are your elves. They're pointy-eared, they're long-lived, they think they're better than everyone else, they're elves. The Eldar have been around for a very long time. They're a very old race, and they're a very advanced race with a lot of very advanced technology. Their main shtick is that one of the 4 Chaos Gods, Slaanesh that I mentioned, they're responsible for creating it. That at the height of their empire, they had a period where they were engaging in so much debauchery and so much excess and extravagance that all of those negative emotions congeal together in one massive lump, from billions and billions of Eldar engaging in it to just spout out Slaanesh as a new god. Now, there are 2 names here, the Eldar and the Jukari. The Eldar being the 40k equivalent of light elves or high elves in a fantasy setting, and the Jukari being the equivalent of dark elves. The difference between the 2 being that Eldar are trying to fight Slaanesh by resisting anything that has to do with fueling it. So they avoid excess and debauchery and things that would give Slaanesh more power. That doesn't mean they don't engage in things like sex or enjoyment or anything. It just means that they're very, very careful not to take those things to extremes that would give Slaanesh food to feed on. On top of this, because Slaanesh is from the Eldar, they created it, Slaanesh is very invested in Eldar souls. When an Eldar dies, their soul directly goes to Slaanesh. The primary difference between the Eldar and the Jukari are that the Eldar, well, they're both Eldar, but like normal Eldar and Jukari. The normal Eldar avoid their soul going to Slaanesh by trapping it in a little rock that keeps them from going to the afterlife. So when they die, their soul goes into this little rock, and it can be recovered, and they can be reincarnated. The Jukari avoid Slaanesh by being awful, awful little gremlins. They torture people, they wildly engage in the excess that creates Slaanesh. They swing the opposite way of the normal Eldar. They are doing everything they can that would fuel Slaanesh to create as much of these negative emotions as possible to stave Slaanesh off. While Slaanesh is feeding on these things, they're relatively safe and not at risk. When they die, they have all of these awful, awful flesh sciences that can regrow them in flesh labs, like Shao Kahn's flesh pits. It's really gross and disgusting. These are if you're into body horror, if you're into like reinterpretations of Frankenstein that just crank the gothic horror up to 20,000, the Jukari are for you. Next up are the Necrons. The Necrons are a race more old. They are older. I don't know why I said more old. They are older than the Eldar and pretty much anything else on this list. They are one of the oldest races in the galaxy. When they were still young, they lived on a very irradiated world that horribly messed up their bodies and made their lives living hell. And to escape that, they biotransferred their consciousnesses into these metal skeletal bodies, leaving behind their flesh entirely. So now they live as skeleton robot people. As it turns out, that was bad for a whole bunch of reasons that Necron novels will get into. But their main goal, after like 60 million years of dealing with it and then going into deep hibernation to avoid the problems this caused, have now reawakened. They're looking to reconquer the galaxy like they had long, long ago, and they're looking to find a way to both stave off the other threats of the galaxy and get back their original organic bodies now that they have the technology to make their lives not hell outside of their skeletal bodies. The Tau, the almost exact opposite of the Necrons, the Tau are one of the youngest races in the setting. The Tau are only a few thousand years old and have rapidly advanced within a very short amount of time for a sapient species, to the point that in that time they've gone from stone-chucking cavemen to one of the most technologically advanced species in the setting in certain regards. In combat, they fight almost entirely with ranged weaponry, with lasers, with railguns, with highly advanced sci-fi guns, whereas the rest of the setting will also use advanced sci-fi weapons, just not as much, and they'll also engage in good old-fashioned melee. We can make fun of the Tau for being terrible in melee later. We don't have time for that today. Next up are the Tyranids. The Tyranids are these horrible little monsters that came from outside of the galaxy and invaded it from somewhere else, with a lot of theories about where they originally came from circulating around. They are almost entirely, I don't know why I said almost, they are entirely biological in every way. The ships they use to travel from one planet to another, the ranged weapons they use, everything about them is an organism in some way. And the way they operate is they will invade a world, send down all of their different creatures, who then ravage it and feast on every particulate of matter that is organic on it. Every single living thing, down to the microscopic organisms in the dirt and in the air. They eat all of it to collect all of its biomatter so that they can suck it all back up into their bioships to use in the creation of more Tyranids. And left unchecked, they would just sweep across the galaxy, leaving barren rocks of plants in their wake until they have eaten literally everything that is living in the entire Milky Way galaxy. My voice is going, and I'm almost done. I thought it would last longer. Last but not least are the Orcs. The Orcs are also a very old race, comparable to the Eldar and the Necrons. A long time ago, the Necrons made war with this other group of aliens that aren't really important other than this, and to combat the Necrons and the Eldar, this group of aliens made the Orcs. At the time, the Orcs were very highly advanced, very smart, using very advanced weaponry, but since then, in the millions of years since this war, the Orcs have degenerated into a mostly stupid berserker culture of these horrible mongrel raiders that just don't want to construct or build or do anything. They only want to fight. They only want to destroy. That's the only thing that makes them happy and gives them a purpose. Of note to the Orcs are two things, and it's what makes them a fan favorite. The first is that they are very goofy. Make no mistake, everything on this list is terrifying. If you were to face down a Necron flayed one, or a Tyranid, or a Jukari mandrake, or anything I've listed here, you would most likely crap your pants. All of this is terrifying. This is a horror setting in its DNA. But the orcs are very goofy to read about. They speak in Cockney accents. They engage in goofy hijinks. They are easily one of the most lighthearted to read about when you're the one reading about them, not the one experiencing being attacked by them. Of note as well to the orcs are the fact that their technology is kind of ramshackle and weird. It's built out of junk that they find and cobble together and believe works. The orcs aren't really psychic or sorceress in the way that Chaos with its magic powers are, or the Eldar, or the Psykers of the Imperium of Man are. A bunch of these other factions have sorcerers that draw on the warp for the use of magic powers. The orcs aren't really like that for the most part, with a few exceptions. What they have instead is this massive gestalt psychic field that spreads across all orcs that makes it so that if they believe something, it more or less becomes true. If they cobble together a bunch of junk into what they think is a gun, and they think it will work as a gun, it will work as a gun, despite tiny mechanical flaws that if this orc were killed and a human picked up this gun, it would now just be junk. It wouldn't work at all. That gets blown to wild extremes by the fandom making jokes about the orcs, to the point of like, people will joke an orc will just believe they're a tank and that makes them a tank. That's not true. That's not canon to the lore. But what is canon to the lore is that there's this little goofy quirk to them that their junk ramshackle kids next door creations actually work despite the fact that they shouldn't. So that is the main 7 factions of Warhammer 40k. I have glossed over a great deal of content in talking about them. There is so much more to learn and so much more to read about. I love this franchise. I love reading about it. Multiple of its books are my favorites. And I would even say they're my favorite books of all time. Like, I dearly love these books, and I love these stories, and I love a lot of the characters these stories are about. And I hope that if you knew nothing about Warhammer going into this video, I hope something in all of this caught your eye. I hope you found something interesting, and I hope you go on to love it as much as I do. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you later.